The action showed bad gunnery. This would have to be corrected. The fogging of sights and windshields had to be corrected. Torpedo and bombing attacks must be closely coordinated, thus the success at Coral Sea. Carriers must have 2 long-range radar sets. Operations of land-based aircraft and fleet units must be better coordinated. Bombs and torpedoes must be improved. The 1,000-pound bomb was not suitable. The torpedo warheads were not large enough. Replacement units for plane crews must be made available. Screening ships against torpedo attacks should be placed in 1,500 to 2 500-yard circles around the carriers. The battle was over, and much was learned from it. The problem, however, was that as far as the mechanical aspects were concerned, even when the defects were known, Nimitz could do little about them in time to improve his forces for the next big struggle. For even as the battle report of Coral Sea was being written at Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway was upon him. One day early in May, Lieutenant Commander Edwin T. Layton, Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer, came into Admiral Nimitz's office to present the Admiral with a detailed analysis he had worked up with Lieutenant Commander Rochefort, showing the probable intentions of the Japanese, based on intercepted Japanese naval radio dispatches. Thanks to Rochefort's partial breakdown of the Japanese naval code, the intelligence men were able to read enough of the material to gain important clues. Nimitz took up Layton's report with his senior staff. What Dremel and Pai had feared from the beginning seemed to be materializing: a Japanese move into the western and northern Pacific. The analysis was imperfect, and there was room for doubt. The Japanese had used a code name for the place they planned to invest, and Nimitz was not absolutely certain this was Midway. He made a test. In the clear, he sent a message that indicated that Midway was short of water. A few hours later, the Japanese indicated that the place they would attack was short of water. By May 16th, Nimitz was certain that unless the Japanese were using massive radio deception for some reason he could not understand, they were planning a major offensive in the Central or North Pacific. Specifically, he feared, the attack against Midway and a raid on Oahu around the first week in June. What was to be done? The striking force must be used. That force now was down to 3 carriers, one of them injured. Perhaps the carriers could be assisted by a battleship covering force, but the pre-war battleships were very slow, and although Admiral Pai was a brave and intelligent officer, these battleships would need very strong protection from lightships if it was worthwhile at all to move them out from the west coast. The problem was to get Halsey into Pearl and out again, with his 2 sound carriers, and to bring the Yorktown back and get her repaired in time. King, perhaps sensing that if the forces at Pearl Harbor were lost, he would have nothing else for West Coast protection, decided against the use of the battleships in the coming struggle. Layton was queried and queried again, and he said he would stake his reputation on the accuracy of his reports. So Nimitz decided to lay it out in one piece, to make the supreme effort, hazarding the American forces, as Pai had been unwilling to do in the Wake confrontation. On May 18th, Nimitz held a final planning conference. He decided then to reinforce Midway with a part of a raider battalion, station 4 submarines off the islands, use Midway to stage army bombers, use a dozen PBYs for searching, and employ Task Force 16 plus the Yorktown, if it could be repaired in time. He would also send out a North Pacific force under Admiral Theobald to move to an Alaskan rendezvous. Admiral Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, proposed to take Midway, occupy the Aleutians, and raid Oahu. But through the efforts of Rochefort and his associates, the Americans had a very good idea of what the Japanese planned to do, and when and where. The 7 old battleships were to sail east to the Pacific coast. Task Force 16, arriving at Pearl Harbor about May 26th, would be turned around in 2 days and sent to Midway by June 1st. Task Force 17 would arrive at Pearl Harbor on May 28th, and if the Yorktown could be repaired there in 4 days, it would be done. That was the key to the whole defense, for Saratoga at San Diego could not be ready for sea until June 5th, and Wasp, headed for the Pacific, could not arrive in time. In mid-May, estimating the enemy courses of action, Nimitz and his staff erred slightly in assessing Admiral Yamamoto's strategy. He wrote, "The enemy knows our building program, and that in time our forces will be sufficiently strong to take the offensive. He further knows our defences are inadequate now, but gradually being strengthened. Hence, from the time factor alone, such operation should be conducted, at the earliest possible time. While he is extended, he is able to assemble a considerable force, as most of the occupied territory is unable to make any real effort. He knows that Australia is being heavily reinforced from the United States and would undoubtedly desire to cut that supply line. But he may also consider Midway to be just another Wake and Alaska undefended. Regardless of our ideas of his strategic possibilities, the purpose here is to discuss immediate possibilities. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had become so worried about the increasing activity of the American fleet in the south that he proposed an action that should destroy that fleet. His worries were based on what Halsey, Fletcher, Brown and Fitch had accomplished in their raids, and on Yamamoto's knowledge of the United States' industrial potential. He had opposed war against the United States in the first place because he knew that potential and was only too well aware of Japan's slender resources in steel and oil. While the rest of the empire and much of the naval high command basked in the happy glory of success, Yamamoto warned that unless he could knock out the American fleet, there was going to be trouble. Within 2 years, he said, the balance of naval power would shift to the United States unless the American fleet could be put out of action in 1942. Yamamoto proposed then to occupy Midway Island, and also the Aleutians, and thus pose the double-barreled threat to the United States of enemy forces in their very backyard. He suggested that such occupation, along with the destruction of the American fleet, would make the government of the United States negotiate a peace that would leave Japan free to expand in China and the waters of the Pacific Ocean. One of the deciding factors in persuading the Naval General Staff to Yamamoto's view was the Doolittle-Tokyo raid in April. The General Staff agreed to a 4-point plan for 1942. June, capture Midway, Adak and Kiska. July, invade New Caledonia and Fiji. July, stage carrier strikes on Australia. August, send the combined fleet to strike Johnston and the Hawaiian Islands. Perhaps it was just as well that the real intentions of Yamamoto and his men were unknown, and that the Japanese striking power was underestimated. The Japanese were bringing to Midway 4 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 14 destroyers, and 5 oilers in the striking force. To cover the actual occupation of Midway, they would have 2 battleships, 9 cruisers, 1 light carrier, 11 destroyers, and various other ships. To screen the transports would come another 11 destroyers, plus seaplane carriers, minesweepers, and a dozen transports in the train. Then there was the main body, with 3 more battleships, a light carrier and 2 seaplane carriers, a cruiser, and 13 more destroyers, which could either accompany the Aleutian invasion force or the Midway force, or attack the American fleet. As for intentions, certainly Admiral Yamamoto wanted to occupy Midway. Having done so, and having created a Japanese airbase there, he proposed to challenge the remnants of the American fleet and destroy them, thus making the Pacific Ocean into a Japanese lake. Radio intelligence indicated that the Japanese left Saipan on May 26th for Midway. Having set the wheels in motion, Nimitz's task was to sit, wait, and take advantage of opportunity. Nimitz received a serious blow that day. Admiral Halsey brought Task Force 16 into port. One look at Halsey, and Nimitz knew that his favourite fighting commander could not be available for Midway. The strain of the past few months, plus personal family problems of the most serious nature, had affected Halsey's nerves, and he was suffering from skin eruptions that made sleep impossible and kept him in constant pain. It was off to the hospital for Halsey, and then came the problem of choosing a substitute for him. At this time, several basic changes were in the offing. Vice Admiral Wilson Brown had fallen ill while on the Pacific coast, and had said something about feeling that he needed a rest. He was now recovered. His statement, however, gave Admirals Jacobs and King the chance they wanted, to remove him for a younger man, and they assigned him to the 1st Naval District. In essence, as far as the war was concerned, this amounted to deportation to Siberia. Admiral Dremel was severely shaken by events of the past few months, and his constant vigil in the nights. Also, he was not thinking along Nimitz's lines, and was not effective as Chief of Staff. Dremel then was to replace Brown as commander of the amphibious force of the Pacific Fleet, still just a potential unit for the most part. Both men took the change in good part, as admirals almost always did. Brown was disappointed and said as much to Nimitz, who wrote him a very friendly letter assuring the old admiral that he, Nimitz, had nothing to do with the change. It was true, strictly speaking, because Nimitz had abjured the responsibility and thrown it back on Washington. For a new Chief of Staff, Nimitz chose Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had proved himself in his forays with Halsey as an aggressive fighting admiral, and more, in the seasons on the folding chairs in Nimitz's office, as a shrewd and trained strategist. Spruance was a small, trim man whose passion for exercise exceeded even that of Nimitz. It was said that Spruance liked nothing better than a 10-mile walk to spruce himself up for the day. He was a Baltimore boy, a few years younger than Nimitz, and had graduated from the Naval Academy in the class of 1901. His record at the Academy had been good. He stood 26th in a class of 209 graduates. He was 2 years behind Nimitz, a year behind Gormley, Fletcher, Towers, Dremel, and Fitch. Spruance was distinguished at the Academy for his studies in electrical engineering, but later he spent 6 years at the Naval War College, 5 of them as a member of the staff, which meant that he was more than an apt student of naval tactics and strategy. He was not an airman, but he had a strong respect for the principal weapon at the fleet's disposal in this coming fight. "The carrier," Spruance said, "is a highly mobile, extremely vulnerable airfield from which you can operate short-range aircraft and do much more accurate bombing than long-range bombers from land air bases can do." After considering the possible commanders who could move quickly into action, and recalling Halsey's words of high praise for Spruance, Nimitz chose Spruance to lead the Halsey task force into battle. Nimitz was not totally pleased with the actions of his commanders in Task Force 17, at least not at that moment. On May 27th, Task Force 17 entered port, and Admiral Fletcher came to headquarters to report himself to Nimitz. There were some searching questions about Fletcher's activities in the past 3 months in the South Pacific. King might be one to judge in anger, but never Nimitz, and gently he asked Fletcher to explain why his force had been so ineffectual. Fletcher retired to his flagship then, and wrote a long explanatory letter about his activities. Nimitz read, and on May 29th he made his decisions and wrote King a letter that indicated the state of affairs at Pearl Harbor on the eve of the Midway battle. "Dear King, I have finally had an opportunity to discuss with Fletcher during a 3-day stay in port his operations in the Coral Sea area and to clear up what appeared to be a lack of aggressive tactics of his force. I also discussed with him the opportunities for using light forces in night attacks following the aerial attacks from his carriers in early May. Both these matters have been cleared up to my entire satisfaction and, I hope, will be to yours. The long delay and apparent lack of aggressive tactics can be charged partly to lack of sufficiently reliable combat intelligence upon which to base operations, to the necessity for replenishment of fuel and provisions, and to the replacement of defective leak-proof tanks in fighter planes. I hope and believe that. You will agree with me that Fletcher did a fine job and exercised superior judgment in his recent cruise in the Coral Sea. He is an excellent sea-going, fighting naval officer, and I wish to retain him as a task force commander in the future." Nimitz noted that Halsey was sick, but thought it was only a temporary indisposition. "He is in the best of spirits, full of vim and vigour, and anxious to get going again. But he does need a short period of rest. He is neither ill nor on the sick list." Fletcher with Task Force 17 will leave on the forenoon of May 30th to join Spruance and to take charge of the 2 task forces which contains 3 carriers. I have not yet separated Task Force 16 into 2 task forces, each with a carrier, but expect to do so after these operations are over, At this time, it is essential that our organization be stabilized as much as possible. The Yorktown was docked yesterday for inspection and repair of a minor leak. When she leaves tomorrow, the 30th of May, she will have a full complement of planes and will be in all respects ready to give a good account of herself. We are very actively preparing to greet our expected visitors with the kind of reception they deserve, and we will do the best we can with what we have. We are thankful for the many contributions now coming in from the Army. To offset the bad news about Halsey, there was good news about Yorktown. Although Nimitz had underestimated the damage so as not to worry King, the carrier really was not too badly hurt, and could be put in service by May 29th, if dry-docked to patch oil leaks and reinforced internally. Some 1,400 men poured into her and worked for 2 days and nights, doing a reconstruction job that Admiral Fitch had estimated would take 3 months. Fitch, by the way, backed Fletcher's actions in the South Pacific all the way. Later, Admiral J.J. Clark was to write that Lexington could have been saved if only Fletcher had sent off planes he had on deck, which could have intercepted the Japanese attack on the other carrier. Clark, who had once been executive officer of the Yorktown, was critical of Fletcher and Captain Elliot Buckmaster. Fitch's comment, "He was not there." On May 28th, Admiral Spruance left Pearl Harbor with Task Force 16, which consisted of the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, with 6 cruisers and 9 destroyers. 2 days later, Admiral Fletcher came out in the reconstituted Yorktown with 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers. Nimitz had shown his faith in Fletcher by putting him in charge of the operation. "You will be governed by the principle of calculated risk," Nimitz wrote in his orders to the 2 commanders, "which you will interpret to mean the avoidance of exposure of your force to attack by superior enemy forces without good prospect of inflicting greater damage on the enemy." Nimitz had suggested that they move to a point northeast of Midway, where they could flank the Japanese as they came in from the northwest. Spruance and Fletcher agreed. Spruance arrived in the area, about 200 miles northeast of Midway, on the morning of June 1st. Fletcher arrived the next afternoon. Both forces had fueled before meeting, and were probably as ready as they would ever be for action. They were very careful. Spruance learned that the radio operators on Enterprise had picked up a high-frequency TBS, talk between ships message from Pearl Harbor to the inshore patrol just off the islands. It was a freak. TBS was not supposed to extend more than a few miles, but it spooked Spruance so that he ordered his task force to keep off the TBS unless absolutely necessary. And he gave the pilots grave warning. He would not use the radio to bring back any carrier planes that might get lost while on a mission. Even his message to task force was transmitted by signalmen, not by radio or TBS. As the Americans converged and began to search and wait, the Japanese moved steadily down on them. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was moving from the northwest, with a force built around the 4 carriers Soryu, Hiryu, Kaga, and Akagi. 300 miles behind was Admiral Yamamoto's main force. The 2nd carrier striking force, and the Attu and Kiska invasion forces, all under Vice Admiral Bushiro Hosogaya, had split off and were coming near the Aleutians from the southwest. Vice Admiral Shiru Takasu led a screening force that would split off and follow the invasion force about 500 miles behind. And finally, up from Saipan in the southwest came the transports and the minesweepers, and the heavy cruiser from Guam, and from Japan itself the main body of the landing force that would invade Midway and make it part of the Japanese Empire. The Japanese submarines were to set up 2 picket lines, about halfway between Hawaii and Midway, for it was the Japanese idea that the American fleet was sitting in Pearl Harbor and would have to be drawn out. The Midway invasion was expected to draw out the Americans, so the striking force that included Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers could be alerted by the submarine pickets, make a few calculations, and then polish off the American carriers once and for all as they steamed up into the trap. The Americans were lucky. The Japanese submarines arrived late on station, and the American task forces were already past them on their way to Midway. The Japanese had provided for seaplane reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor on May 30th. The flying boats were to meet Japanese submarines off French frigate shoals, refuel, and carry out their mission. but when the submarines arrived there, they found 2 American seaplane tenders at anchor and 2 American flying boats also there. So the Japanese cancelled their plans for a look, which would have warned them that only 1 American carrier was in harbour. They might even have seen Fletcher's force move out, heading toward the Midway atoll. At 0904 on June 3rd, a Midway search plane came upon part of the Japanese minesweeping group coming up from the southwest and reported 2 cargo ships sighted 500 miles out. 20 minutes later, another patrol plane reported 6 ships, again coming up from the southwest, 700 miles out. Later, another contact was made with 11 ships. That afternoon, 9 B-17S from Midway flew out to intercept the 11-ship force. They dropped bombs but did not hit anything because they came in at extremely high altitude. At dawn on Thursday, June 4th, Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers launched 36 horizontal bombers, 36 dive bombers, and 36 fighters against Midway, and brought the second wave of the same type of planes up on deck to ready for another strike. This time, however, the multi-purpose horizontal bombers were armed with torpedoes in case ship targets should appear. As the Japanese carrier planes flew toward Midway, 16 B-17S took off to attack the transports, which were bringing the invaders from the west. At 0545 in the morning, an American patrol bomber caught sight of 2 enemy carriers. All the planes at Midway that could fly took off, and the torpedo bombers, Army B-26S and Marine dive bombers headed for the carriers. The 27 fighters were kept over Midway for protection. The assorted bombers went in against heavy anti-aircraft fire and zooming Japanese fighters. The B-26S hit nothing, and 2 of the 4 were shot down. The TBFs hit nothing, and 5 of the 6 were splashed. The Marine dive bomber pilots were inexperienced. Instead of dive bombing, they came in to glide bomb. 12 were shot down, and they hit nothing. The B-17S diverted to the carriers, came in at 20,000 feet, and hit nothing. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns and the Zero pilots could not reach them, so they lost no planes. The Japanese carrier planes, meanwhile, slashed across Midway and began bombing and strafing, taking care to save the runways they thought they would be using in a few days. In the Japanese carrier force, Admiral Nagumo surveyed the situation before him. The Americans still had air power at Midway, which ought to be knocked out. He had no reports of surface shipping anywhere around. So the Admiral ordered the bombers of Akagi and Kaga back down to the hangar decks, where the torpedoes would be removed and changed for bombs. The Japanese were to sight the Americans just before 0730 that morning, but even then the identification was confused, and it was an hour later before Admiral Nagumo learned that there were big ships in the area, and concluded, without immediate confirmation, that there must be a carrier in the bunch. The Americans, moving cautiously with their far smaller force, were in action already. Early in the morning, Admiral Fletcher had launched a dawn security search to the north, looking for the Japanese they knew to be in the area, because of the sighting before 0600 of the carrier planes, and the sighting of 2 of the carriers a few minutes later. 2 carriers and battleships bearing 320, distance 180, course 135, speed 24, came the message from the flying boat. When Admiral Spruance was informed, he turned on a course to intercept and raised the speed of Task Force 16 to 25 knots. Fletcher instructed Spruance to attack the enemy carriers when they were definitely located. Miles Browning, the slender, caustic Chief of Staff of Task Force 16, whose services Spruance had secured from the ailing Halsey, suggested that the timing of the first attack on the Japanese be made as soon as possible. That way, said Browning, there was a good chance of catching the Japanese with their decks foul with newly landed planes that were unready for action. Spruance's plan had been to launch at 0900, when he estimated that they would be around 100 miles from the enemy. Since the American torpedo bombers had a range of only 175 miles, that distance seemed safe for recovery of the TBDs. But Spruance was quick to see Browning's point, and he undertook the calculated risk. He launched without actual location of the enemy, hoping he knew their position, which he estimated to be about 155 miles away, bearing 239. Captain Murray in the Enterprise and Captain Mark Mitcher in the Hornet were ordered to turn south into the wind and begin launching just after 0700. First, the combat air patrol went off and began circling the formation. Next went the dive bombers, some armed with 500-pound and some with 1,000-pound bombs. The torpedo planes took off, followed by fighters that were to escort the slow torpedo bombers to the target and protect them. At this point, the inexperience of the Americans influenced the course of events. About 20 minutes before the last planes were launched, the presence of the American ships was apparently discovered by a Japanese search plane. That would account for the turn of the Japanese carriers off the course on which they had been spotted earlier. Spruance then ordered the dive bombers from Enterprise to go ahead of the torpedo planes and fighters and hit the carriers. This decision put an end to the coordinated attack that had been planned, but Spruance was more interested in surprise. Task Force 17 was operating independently and launching its planes as well. But as the planes began to search the expected area, they did not find the Japanese, who had changed course. First to find the enemy were the planes of Torpedo Squadron 8, which had flown off Hornet. In the morning confusion, the Enterprise fighters accompanied the Hornet torpedo bombers instead of their own, and then lost touch even with these bombers. So Torpedo 8 suddenly found itself in sight of the enemy, with no protection. Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, the leader of Torpedo 8, finally saw the Japanese as he was running low on fuel. He reported the contact and asked permission to withdraw and refuel before attacking. But Spruance and Browning aboard the flagship knew the importance of surprise in a carrier battle. The reply was negative. "Attack at once!" was the order. Without fighter protection, low on fuel, knowing how the deck was stacked against him, Waldron headed in. The weather was good, the visibility was excellent. The whole approach was made at low altitude, in complete view of the Japanese and their deadly Zero fighter planes. The squadron was in 2 divisions. First came 4 2-plane sections, then 2 more 2-plane sections and 1 3-plane section. Lieutenant Commander Waldron headed for the southernmost of the carriers until he saw the mushrooms of the anti-aircraft fire. Then he turned to the central carrier. When they were about 16,000 yards out, the Zeros came down onto the deck and the slaughter began. Ensign G.H. Gay, a naval reserve officer, was flying one of those TBDs in the last section of the 2nd Division. As Gay moved toward the target, he heard an anguished voice from his gunner. He had been hit. Gay went on in, dropped his torpedo at 800 yards, and it missed, like all the other torpedoes of Torpedo 8. He pulled up over the bow of the carrier and turned sharply into her wake, but then a Zero dived down and an explosive shell carried away his left rudder control. A bullet struck. This report is contrary to the legend of Waldron's heroic sacrifice. It is, however, documental. See notes. Him in the left arm, and a fragment hit him in the left hand. He took the plane down, made a crash landing, but the right wing carried away and the plane began to sink. He had no time to rescue his radio man before the plane went down, leaving the ensign treading water. The rubber boat in its bag had floated clear, and so had a black cushion from the bomber compartment. Gay inflated his life jacket, grabbed the boat bag and held it, and covered his head with the black cushion so the Japanese would not see him. Several Zeros zoomed low, but he was not observed. Ensign Gay then had a ringside seat at the arena where the Kaga, the Akagi, and the Soryu were performing. At first it was quiet, except for the landing of Zeros on the carriers. He noted, with the interest of a professional, how the other fellows did it, coming in on long approaches from straight astern with long intervals between planes. And then the action began. Hornet's dive bombers had found nothing and went empty-handed to their carrier when they ran low on gas. Enterprise's torpedo planes found the Japanese at about 0930, but their attack was more successful than that of Torpedo 8, only in that 4 of the 14 TBDs managed to get back to their carrier. There were no hits, but the very ineptness of the American attack worked in its favor this day, for the Japanese grew careless, and their fighter cover was pulled down low above the sea by the chase for the lumbering torpedo bombers. As the TBDs flamed into the sea, Enterprise's dive bombers were searching for the enemy. They did not find the Japanese where they expected them, but an accommodating Japanese destroyer led them to the carrier force, and they sighted the enemy at 1005. The torpedo bombers had accomplished two other useful feats in their sacrifice. They had caused the carriers to maneuver constantly during this critical period, and their brave gestures against the impossible odds they faced had given the Japanese a certain contempt for the American weapons, if a definite respect for American willingness to die. The Japanese had watched the B-17S come in like little specks in the stratosphere and drop their hopeless bombs. They had watched the clumsy tactics of the ill-trained marine bombers and the misses of the B-26S too. Suddenly, however, down screamed the dive bombers of the Enterprise. Ensign Gay, who was watching from his wet ringside seat, said that most of them did not even seem to be using their dive flaps, for they came in at very high speed, dropped their bombs, pulled out just above the water, and sped away. Kaga and Akagi were just getting ready to launch their planes for a strike, when the bombers began scoring hits. In a moment, Gay saw flames arising from the flight decks, and billowing black clouds of smoke dirtied the blue sky. Soon Akagi was a wreck, and Admiral Nagumo transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara. Then the Yorktown dive bombers found the carriers and attacked Soryu. The torpedo planes suffered the fate of the squadrons of the Hornet and the Enterprise. Only 2 of a dozen returned to the Yorktown, but the dive bombers started several fires on Soryu, and not one dive bomber from Yorktown was even damaged, so thorough was the confusion of the Japanese. Spruance was elated with the performance of Enterprise and Yorktown, but much less pleased with that of the men of Hornet. He wanted that 4th carrier, and had Hornet's planes done their job, Hiryu might have been found that morning. Instead, Hiryu's planes found Yorktown at 12:05, and the dive bombers put 3 holes in her, stopping her, starting fires, and damaging the flight deck. In 2 hours, the damage was partly repaired. Yorktown could operate her planes and make 19 knots. But a few minutes after she launched her second strike, Hiryu's torpedo bombers came in and put 2 torpedoes into the carrier, jamming the left rudder and giving her a list that soon stood at 23 degrees. Admiral Fletcher moved his flag to the cruiser Astoria. Soon Captain Buckmaster ordered the Yorktown abandoned, for which he was later criticised severely by some of Young Turks, especially the fighting Admiral J.J. Clark. But in turn, the planes of Enterprise had found the Hiryu by 1700 that afternoon, and sped in to attack. 4 dive bombers scored hits on this 4th carrier, and soon she was dead in the water. Hornet and Enterprise groups now attacking 4 carrier located by your search planes, was the message Admiral Spruance sent to Fletcher, who was in overall command still. Hornet about 20 miles east of me. Have you any instructions for future operations? Fletcher replied, Negative. Will conform to your movements. Thus, a gallant Admiral Fletcher, knowing the battle was virtually won, turned tactical command and the chance for glory into the hands of his subordinate, because Spruance's primary weapons, the carriers, were intact and ready to fight, while Fletcher's own major weapon was out of action. He detached the 2 cruisers from the task force and sent them to Spruance. He would keep the destroyers and attempt to salvage the Yorktown. After the first attack on Yorktown, her planes began landing on the Hornet and the Enterprise, and served in fact as replacements for the many that had been lost in the day's action. Some of these were lost to enemy action, many to force landings when their fuel ran out. After recovering all the aircraft from the attack on Hiryu, Spruance headed east, away from the enemy. He knew that out to the west was the enemy, a powerful force, more powerful than his own, perhaps. Here is the way Spruance spoke of his decision immediately after the battle. After recovering our air groups following their second attack, Task Force 16 stood to the eastward, southward and back to the westward during the night. I did not feel justified in risking a night encounter with possibly superior enemy forces, but on the other hand, I did not want to be too far away from Midway the next morning. I wished to have a position from which either to follow up retreating enemy forces or break up a landing attack on Midway. At this time, the possibility of the enemy having a 5th CV, fleet carrier, somewhere in the area, possibly with his occupation force or else to the northwestward, still existed. In fact, Admiral Yamamoto wanted a surface engagement. He believed there was only one American carrier and that it was out of action. When Admiral Nagumo began to withdraw, Yamamoto relieved him and put Vice Admiral Kondo in charge of the striking force. Kondo moved toward Midway to make a night bombardment, but later that mission was cancelled and the Japanese retired to the northwest. At daybreak, Task Force 16 was moving west at 15 knots. The weather was very bad. The submarine Tambor made the first report of the Japanese, sighted 90 miles west of Midway. Early that morning, trying to avoid the Tambor, the Japanese cruisers Mikuma and Mogami collided, and then headed slowly away from the action toward the repair station at Truk. Spruance was looking for the enemy. As the weather cleared, he learned that one group was west of Midway and the other group was northwest. He chose the northwest group to chase. It contained, he understood, the crippled carrier and 2 battleships, one damaged. All he found that day were 2 small ships, apparently destroyers. The planes took a night landing, and one crashed in the water astern of Enterprise because of the pilot's unfamiliarity with the technique. The crew was saved, and all other planes made it aboard the 2 carriers, although sometimes landing on the wrong one. That second night, Spruance headed west. I figured the enemy DDs, destroyers, would report our attack, and that he might either get the protection of bad weather ahead, or else change course to the westward to head for Japan and to throw us off. Next morning, the search planes found 2 groups of Japanese ships southwest of the task force, about 40 miles apart. They had found Mogami and Mikuma, and dive bombers sank Mikuma that day and damaged Mogami so badly that it took 1 year to repair her when she reached Truk. Identification by the pilots was so faulty that they believed Mikuma was a battleship. But what difference? The victory was completely glorious. The reason, Spruance indicated, was the uncertainty of American knowledge about the dimensions of these Japanese ships. Before nightfall, he questioned the pilots of 2 photographic planes and came to the conclusion that the sunk ship was a cruiser of the Mogami class, a pretty good guess. She was definitely larger than the other cruiser accompanying her, Spruance said. Mogami's bow had been torn off in the collision with Mikuma, and that was the reason for the wrong conclusion in her case. Meanwhile, on Saturday, June 6th, a Japanese submarine torpedoed the Yorktown, sinking her and the destroyer Hamon, which was alongside, taking away some of the glory. Admiral Yamamoto, still hoping to salvage some shred of victory from his inglorious defeat, attempted to lure Spruance into the range of the shore-based Japanese aircraft at Wake Island. By the end of the day, Spruance's force was running low on fuel, and he also felt that he had pushed his luck about as far as was sensible. The Japanese shore-based planes had a range of 600 miles from Wake, and he was determined to stay outside the 700-mile circle. He sent back destroyers and found himself with only 4, not enough to screen his carriers against the Japanese submarines known to be in the area. So Spruance turned east, and the Battle of Midway came to a close. At Pearl Harbor, Nimitz and his officers had been waiting eagerly for the bits of news as they came in. On June 4th, Nimitz said, "It may be the greatest sea battle since Jutland." If the outcome was as unfavorable to the Japanese as he hoped, it might end their expansion in the Pacific. Nimitz was worried, however, because the total destruction of Torpedo 8 symbolized what had happened to the American fleet that day. The United States had lost a large percentage of highly trained pilots who would be hard to replace. The Japanese, of course, had lost far more, the pilots and air crews of nearly every plane of the 4 carriers. The bite of Midway would be felt by the Japanese Naval Air Force throughout the rest of the war. On the second day, Nimitz issued a conservative communiqué about the victory. The staff was jubilant, terming the battle a major defeat for the enemy. "This was a great day for the American Navy," said the Grey Book of the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet that day. The Sink Pack Grey Book was the unofficial war diary, very secret and sometimes more informative as to attitudes at Pearl Harbor than any other documents to come out of the war. The nation was not to know the Navy's real role in that battle for a considerable length of time. At Midway, Army B-17 bombers had the first crack at the Japanese and did not score a single hit, yet that failure did not keep the Army Air Corps from claiming it had won the Battle of Midway. Nimitz was constrained by security to forbear from reply. The Japanese would have liked nothing better than to know precisely what had happened to them at Midway and what American dispositions and losses had been. Secretary Knox was aware of the facts and concerned about them, as he indicated to Nimitz, at the same time sending out a new public relations officer, perhaps rather pointedly. Confidentially, the secretary wrote, "There is a great deal of feeling here, and, I understand, also in the fleet, on account of the obvious attempt of the Army Air Corps to play up their part in the Midway battle. It is most unfortunate that they have this disposition, and I have a memorandum on my desk together with a copy of the Honolulu paper which contains a statement by General Arnold, which I propose to discuss with Secretary Stimson at the first opportunity. He feels as strongly as I do about anything likely to produce friction between the two services, and I feel sure that he will take the necessary measures to prevent this sort of thing happening again." This incident was the occasion for deep-seated resentment of the Army by Navy airmen during the Pacific War. Knox did what he could. He was, in private life, publisher of the Chicago Daily News, and he arranged to have war correspondent Robert J. Casey write a series of articles explaining the facts of Midway. But by and large the Army had the first publicity, and many people went through the war believing the B-17S had smashed the Japanese Navy. That Navy was not smashed, but the power of its air force was very definitely curtailed, with the sinking of 4 of her carriers, Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu, and the loss of 250 planes and more than 2,000 men. Having sunk 4 carriers and a Japanese cruiser and destroyed an invasion before it ever got started, Spruance's reaction was typical and terse. In writing to Nimitz, he was primarily interested in what had been learned. The operations during this period have been most interesting and instructive. We must, I think, improve our identification of types from the air. Another point is that emphasis should be placed on continued tracking of enemy forces by shore-based planes whenever conditions permit. It would have been of great assistance if the damaged CV, fleet carrier, had been tracked down on Friday. For use against CVs, particularly those caught with planes on deck, our present bombs are perfect. For use against tough ships with armoured decks, we must have an armour-piercing 1,000-pounds bomb. Against such targets I would use about half of each. The present type works terrible destruction on the unarmoured portion of the ship, but it does not disable, except after many more hits than should be necessary. We have a 1,600-pounds AP bomb now, but to use it our present dive bombers have to reduce their gas carried, which is not a satisfactory solution. Regarding Fletcher, Spruance was most generous. I cannot close without expressing my admiration for the part that Fletcher in the Yorktown played in this campaign. We had a fine and smoothly working coordination between the two task forces before the fighting commenced. When the battle started, the Yorktown's attack and the information her planes furnished were of vital importance to our success, which for some time was hanging in the balance. The Yorktown happened to be between the Hornet and Enterprise and the enemy's 4th and still functioning carrier, so she took his blows. Halsey's splendid staff have made my job easy. I appreciate more than I can tell you the fact that you had sufficient confidence in me to let me take this fine task force to sea during this critical period. It has been a pleasure to have such a well-trained fighting force to throw against the enemy. The reason for the letter was that Spruance had been ordered to move north in the vicinity of the Aleutians, meet with Fitch and the Saratoga group, and then go after the enemy again. This was just what Yamamoto wanted, and he was attempting to lay a trap for Spruance, going so far as to make a plain-language radio broadcast that was supposed to come from a disabled battleship, bait for the Americans. But since Nimitz had begun to suspect the existence of a trap and ordered Spruance back to Pearl Harbor, the effort came to nothing. In a way, the Midway battle had been a make-y-learn cruise of the First Order, for two commanders had learned a great deal about carrier operations. Admiral Mark Mitcher came home in the Hornet with a number of ideas. America needed something to compete with the Japanese Zero fighter, he said. American fighters should have the same fuel capacity as the planes they escorted. Radio silence had been broken on the fighter director circuit. Again, he added a plea for IFF equipment, along with other advice. In his official report, Spruance added that ships unsupported by fighters are easy prey to carrier air attack, which seemed obvious, and that a carrier air group that had suffered heavy losses in action should go ashore to train and receive replacements, meaning the supply of replacement air groups, which was not nearly so obvious. When the action report of the Battle of Midway, some 3 inches of single-spaced typed paper with diagrams and photos, was completed, Nimitz studied it and made some comments for the eyes of Admiral King, matters of gravest importance to the future of naval operations in the war. He advocated the procurement of B-17S and B-24S for the Navy, as better planes than the PBYs for continuous tracking under conditions where enemy air is present. He noted how ineffectual high-altitude horizontal bombing had proved, and recommended that island and coastal base planes be torpedo bombers and dive bombers. He recommended the supply of the Marines with Army-type planes for use from shore bases, instead of the carrier-type planes with their built-in limitations. He noted the lack of coordination of dive bombing and torpedo plane attacks, which cost most of the American torpedo planes. He also noted that the TBD planes in use are fatally inadequate for their purpose. The loss of the brave men who unhesitatingly went to their death in them is grievous. He asked for long-range carrier fighters to protect the better TBFs. Nimitz agreed with Mitcher and Spruance about the superiority in speed, maneuverability, and climb of the Zero. These characteristics must be improved, he said, but not at the cost of reducing our present overall superiority that in the Battle of Midway enabled our carrier fighter squadrons to shoot down about 3 Zero fighters for each of our own lost. Since in most engagements the American fighters were outnumbered, he suggested the increase in the number of fighters in each carrier from 18 to 27. He endorsed Spruance's view on the need for replacement air groups. Nimitz called for sharper, more thorough air training, better, quicker launching and attack, better tracking of enemy formations, and super-frequency voice sets for voice communication. He called attention to improved communications, improved gunnery. Some crews have been in enough battles to consider themselves seasoned veterans. Better aircraft torpedoes with larger warheads designed for high-speed drops, and the 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, King had been critical of Fletcher for not using cruisers and destroyers in night attacks against the Japanese, and the Commander-in-Chief reiterated that criticism of the Midway action. Nimitz had to be prepared to explain. At the same time, he was preparing for his next meeting with King in San Francisco, watching the Aleutian situation, where the Japanese had landed and occupied 2 islands, and preparing for offensive action that was coming later in the South Pacific. On June 29th, Nimitz decided to send Task Force 11, Task Force 18, and the 2nd Marine Division to the South Pacific, where they would report to Gormley. Fletcher was in charge of the force. Sinkpak's plans section was ready with an estimate for an offensive in the Bismarck-Solomons area. Then Nimitz took off in the big flying boat, accompanied by Flag Secretary Commander Preston Mercer and Assistant War Plans Officer Captain Lynd McCormick for Alameda Air Station. Just before 0900 on June 30th, the big plane moved down over San Francisco Bay and prepared to land on the water. Swooping in, she moved low, and as she landed, struck an unnoticed telegraph pole floating in the bay, with such force that the bottom was slashed and the plane nosed over. Immediately, the shocked officers in the greeting contingent ashore sent the launch out for rescue. Nimitz carefully picked himself up in the upside-down plane and clambered out a hatchway. "I'm all right," he shouted to Mercer, "but for God's sake, save that briefcase." The briefcase contained the 3-inch report of the Battle of Midway. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Thomas M. Roscoe of Oakland, was killed in the crash, and several of the other survivors were injured, When the launch reached them, Nimitz climbed in with the others and then stood up. "Sit down, you!" bellowed the coxswain. Nimitz obeyed. A few moments later, the sailor recognized his Pacific Fleet commander and was horrified. He tried to apologize. "Stick to your guns, sailor," Nimitz said. "You were quite right." At the air station, all the survivors were rushed to the hospital for checkup. Nimitz, who hated hospitals and confinement, struggled free shortly and made his way home to Berkeley, where Mrs. Nimitz was spending the war, and found a change of clothes. Mercer, who was as sopping wet as the rest of them, had to put on a loud checked summer suit he had bought in San Diego before the war, and appear in that rig, much to his chagrin, when he met Commander-in-Chief King. Among the exhibits for discussion at the meetings in Vice Admiral D.W. Bagley's office in the Federal Building was a discussion of the role of the battleship by Admiral Pai. Pai suggested that the Japanese loss of 5 carriers in recent weeks had changed the situation so that the battleships might be used for the first time in the war. Still, Pai recognized that the war to date, both here and in Europe, has proven without doubt that even battleships are more vulnerable to torpedoes and bombs than had been previously estimated. This increased vulnerability has been due in large part to higher explosive charges than were considered probable heretofore, and in a large part also to the increased number of hits made by the greatly increased use of the torpedo plane and by the increased proportion of dive bombers. Battleships, then, said Pai, should be employed only where their firepower could be used against ship or shore defence, with enemy air and submarine defences neutralised, or at least anticipated, and the losses discounted. Specifically, Pai considered and discarded the use of battleships against Kiska or Attu in the Aleutians, unless Nimitz proposed to recapture these islands, with the battleships providing support. In the Central Pacific, battleships might be useful against Wake, if accompanied by at least one carrier, Pai said. If the Japanese tried to invade Australia, Pai saw the battleships as useful. Any and all possible naval strength would be of value. But unless logistics could be improved, the operation of Task Force 1, the battleships, would be impracticable for any extended period. In minor amphibious operations, cruiser and carrier support seemed to him enough. When the Japanese hold on important islands was threatened, and the Japanese main fleet might come out, then the battleships should be used to engage the Japanese main fleet. But most practically, the old battleships could be used to prevent invasion of Midway or the Hawaiian Islands. For a battleship man, this acceptance of limitations seemed very progressive, but Pai was always progressive. King agreed with just about everything Pai said, and they discussed the continuing need for development of tactics for large forces. At this meeting, Nimitz and King and the other officers who were present, going in and out to give information on specific subjects, were vitally concerned with the coming offensive to be launched in the South Pacific. Looking ahead, King suggested that the future would mean movement to Truk, then Guam, then Saipan. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the planner whose eye had always been on amphibious operations, had been selected to supervise the landings on Guadalcanal Island, and now Nimitz was ready to send him to Melbourne to discuss the whole operation with Gormley and General MacArthur. The problem involved some change in the line of SINCPAC, SINCSO, WESTPAC responsibility, because the Solomons fell within MacArthur's area, but this would be a Navy show. Turner sat in on the discussions for a time. Nimitz wanted a promotion for Fletcher to Vice Admiral, and King agreed. He had accepted Nimitz's appraisal of Fletcher's actions at Coral Sea. Nimitz also wanted the authority to appoint task force commanders regardless of seniority, an authority he did not then have. They discussed other aspects of the coming operation for a time, and then Turner withdrew. Nimitz and King talked about Alaska, and then about personnel. Mitcher's name came up, and Nimitz spoke highly of him. King and the others had not always spoken so highly of Mitcher. Halsey was still sick, and if he did not come back, Nimitz said, he wanted Aubrey Fitch to become the senior air flag officer of the fleet. Several officers of the Pacific Fleet had been indiscreetly involved in a leak to the press on the breaking of the Japanese naval code, and their fates were discussed. Nimitz broke from the seriousness for a moment to report that he had rented a small house on Oahu for the rest and rehabilitation of senior officers. It came to be called Prostate Rest. Then they got down to the tiresome but vital business of logistics for the expanding naval operations in the South Pacific. They talked about medical storehouses, a fleet anchorage in New Caledonia, and the effective life of a submarine captain. A captain could be expected to hold up for 3 or 4 full patrols, about a year, before needing a prolonged rest. Nimitz asked for more tankers, and this request was discussed in full. The problem, as always these days, was balancing the absolute needs of the Pacific Fleet against the growing demands of the war in Europe. It has been a fearful period of anxiety for us all, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox wrote to Mrs. Knox on June 6th, as the Battle of Midway ended victoriously for the Americans. The outcome will seriously affect the whole war situation in the Pacific. Midway was the turning point. Before Midway, Admiral Nimitz kept away from the press as much as possible. He issued few communiques, and none that could be considered expansive. After Midway, he was convinced that the United States would win the war. He did not predict when it would end, but he did say he believed it would end much earlier than the gloomy prediction, then common, of 1949. Midway also seemed to be the catalyst for another development not nearly so pleasant to contemplate, the divisive and sometimes vitriolic three-way argument over air power. The argument had been nascent for many years, since the days of General Billy Mitchell and his plea for a separate air force. Alexander P. Deseversky had come out with a persuasive program of strategic bombing, which he called Victory Through Air Power, and he was busy writing and lecturing very effectively. General Arnold and the top officers of the Army Air Corps wanted to make a separate air force, which would also take over the Navy's air functions, and within the Navy itself, the airmen, led by Admiral Towers, were agitating for greater responsibility and more control of naval operations. The work of hitting the enemy had so far been done by the submarines, by surface ships in the East Indies, but most gloriously by the carriers. The first 2 great battles, Coral Sea and Midway, had involved carriers and no gun duels. The aviators were grumbling that they ought to have a greater voice. Halsey was still sick, and McCain was working as commander of aircraft in the South Pacific, and the aviators did not regard him as one of them either, because he too was in his 50s when he had learned to fly. Nimitz had inherited an aviation officer, Captain Arthur C. Davis, but the aviators did not consider this nearly enough recognition. Actually, Nimitz was alive to the problem and was already working toward solution. In June, before he had gone to meet with King in San Francisco, Nimitz had made that request to the Commander-in-Chief for the authority to assign force commanders regardless of relative rank. It could be argued, and was by the aviators, that Admiral Fitch should have been in command of the task forces at the Wake Relief Expedition and at Coral Sea, when he was subordinate to Fletcher. Fitch was more acceptable to the young aviators than any other Pacific admiral, for he had taken air cadet training in 1929, when he was 46 years old, and had commanded the seaplane tender Wright, the aircraft carrier Langley, the Naval Air Station at Hampton Roads, Patrol Wing 2, the Lexington, Carrier Division 1, and finally the Air Task Force in the Pacific. Fitch was also thoroughly acceptable to non-aviators, for he had served in battleships, destroyers, mine-layers in the Navy Department, and he had taken the senior course at the Naval War College. He had not been in command at either battle because he was junior by a few numbers to his classmate Fletcher, and it was Navy rule to make the senior officer the OTC, Officer in Tactical Command. I foresee that such a situation may arise in which I will desire to designate a task force commander who is junior in rank to the commander of the cruisers in the force, Nimitz had written King, and he was pressing for this concession. McCain had written Nimitz from the South Pacific about the air situation he faced. He wanted an Air Corps Brigadier General, if he could get one, to assist him in air operations. He was planning bases at Efate and Espiritu Santo, and waiting for Army bombers to come in to assist his force. He and Nimitz were agreed to having a carrier replacement group stationed on every island. McCain said the entire Pacific to the Philippines. In a letter to Nimitz, he said, "Jove never hurled a thunderbolt as destructive as a split-second trained carrier group, vied Lexington pilots." McCain complained about the supply and administrative problem. The letter came in during the Midway operations. By the time Nimitz was able to answer it, the victory had been won. "I regard the entire operation as a wonderful example of coordination and utmost determination by all concerned," Nimitz said. "Our aviators bore the brunt, but decidedly not in vain." Nimitz was concerned with overall air policy, agreeing with McCain that Army aircraft in the South Pacific should be permanently assigned to various bases. "It is most fallacious to expect in emergency, except with rare good luck, to have time to move aircraft to threatened points and get them organized for effective employment." He wanted to get naval aircraft down to McCain as soon as possible, but the shortage of pilots and planes was still dogging him. The situation should soon improve, but the demands for new aircraft, combined with losses of carrier aircraft in action, still have us operating on not much more than a shoestring. It was a serious letter, but Nimitz found time to include a poem, one that he said was slipped under the cabin door of one of our cruiser captains during the last phase of the Battle of Midway. It purported to be a dispatch from the Japanese Commander-in-Chief, 2nd Fleet, to the Commander-in-Chief, 1st Fleet. It read, "Send aid, send it fast. Have lost face, am losing ass." Nimitz was very much concerned about air, obviously. In July, he wrote to Secretary Knox calling for new and better planes both for the carriers and for the land-based marine pilots. "We have learned many lessons, in particular that all our planes do not fill the bill best in the world, at least in the Pacific. In our development of airplane types, we have probably been heavily influenced by the picture in Europe. The little Japs, however, got down to cases and planned specifically for their local problems. Thus they have long-range land-plane fighters for escort and seaplane fighters for work among the atolls, both of which have shown marked usefulness and superiority for the job at hand. In these categories we are decidedly lacking. Again, in the case of the Zero fighter, the Jap has sacrificed various qualities in order to obtain the highest performance and maneuverability. In this case, since I am positive that we must retain such features as tank and armor protection, we can only outdo the enemy by very superior designing." At this time, Nimitz was also concerned about a cloud he saw shaping up on the aerial horizon. Just after Midway, Captain Logan Ramsey of Patrol Wing 2 wrote a secret letter to Nimitz, supplementing the official report of air operations by Midway-based forces during the battle. "Broadly speaking," Ramsey said, "Army air units operating from Midway were distinctly below Navy standards in efficiency, resolution, initiative, and devotion to duty. There was an exception, the squadron led by Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney, and Ramsey suggested that Sweeney's performance was good because he had been working with the Navy during the 6 months just past at Oahu. One Army failure cited by Ramsey was bad navigation. Nimitz found, however, that this was a problem of communications. The Army used a different grid system from the Navy's. Much more serious was the problem of bombing from high altitudes, as high as 30,000 feet. Only Colonel Sweeney's planes had come close enough to the enemy ships even to be damaged by anti-aircraft fire. On June 6th, despite the known lack of enemy air opposition, some B-17 squadron commanders would not take off until they had replenished their oxygen stocks, which would not have been needed below 15,000 feet. Ramsey said he was convinced that, had the B-17S operating from Midway on June 5th and 6th been manned by personnel up to the standard of the Navy patrol plane crews, few, if any, enemy ships within 600 miles of Midway would have been able to escape. Ramsey had given no hint of these opinions to Army people, and the Navy officers had tried hard to smooth over many difficulties. Brigadier General Willis Hale had left Midway on June 3rd, stating that he intended to make the strongest representations to Nimitz and others about the excessive demands being made on the B-17 crews during the battle. His departure, said Ramsey, averted the great danger of rupture of inter-service relations. As if the problem of Army-Navy air relations was not thorny enough, the Navy aviators now began kicking up their heels. Someone in Navy Air planted a story in the Washington Post criticizing the Navy for sending out task force commanders who were not experienced in carrier operations. The criticism obviously referred to the use of spruants at Midway and Fletcher at Coral Sea and Midway, for neither was an aviator. Secretary Knox was very much annoyed by this article and called Admiral Towers on the carpet, saying he would have no more of it. The most ebullient and ambitious of the aviators, however, continued in their contentious ways. Nimitz had greater worries in the Air Department, with the South Pacific offensive very definitely on. In June, the Pacific Fleet received its first reinforcements. They included the carrier Wasp, the new fast battleship North Carolina, the heavy cruiser Quincy, and 7 destroyers. Nimitz was then able to reorganize his carrier task forces. Fitch had Task Force 11, and if Halsey did not come back, he would soon be made senior air officer. Fletcher had Task Force 16, Mark Mitcher had Task Force 17 with the Hornet, and Rear Admiral Lee Noyes, a classmate of Fitch and Fletcher, had Task Force 17 with the Wasp. General MacArthur had said that if the Navy would give him the ships, a couple of carriers, a task force, an amphibious division, and a handful of bombers, he would capture Rabaul. King had opposed the idea and remained steadfast for the Solomons invasion, and that was where the offensive was going. On July 5th, Nimitz received a piece of intelligence that put the whole program in high gear. The Japanese were beginning to build an airfield on Guadalcanal. Its completion would seriously hamper all of King's plans. And so King made one of the major decisions of the war, ordering the seizure of Tulagi, Guadalcanal, and Santa Cruz Islands. Nimitz had the operation order out and in Gormley's hands by July 10th. By this time, MacArthur had his own navy, under Vice Admiral Arthur S. Carpenter, chief of what would become the 7th Fleet, but would not be involved in this operation. Here is how the command would stack up. Gormley would be in command, in charge of strategy, but would not be in the field. Fletcher, who had just been made a vice admiral, would be the officer.